Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the second day of the 2020 International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade. I am the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, and I want to say thank you, everybody, to coming out and supporting us and joining us. What's incredible about these academic conferences is that you didn't have to get out of bed or out of your pajamas if you didn't want to hear some of the latest research on the philosophy and scientific study of atheism. And in fact, you're being joined by students and scholars and academics from all 7 continents. All 7 continents will be represented here at this 3-day International Academic Conference. So thank you so much for joining us. And with that said, I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce my good friend and upcoming scholar, Maarten Boudry. Now, Maarten Boudry's talk today is called In Mysterious Ways on the Cultural Evolution of Beliefs about the Supernatural. Now, Maarten is a postdoctoral fellow of the Flemish Fund for Scientific Research and current holder of the Etienne Vermeersch Chair at Ghent University. In 2011, he defended his dissertation on pseudoscience entitled Here Be Dragons, Exploring the Hinterland of Science. He is the author of more than 40 academic papers published in journals such as The Philosophy of Science, Philosophia, Quarterly Review of Biology, Science and Education, and Biology and Philosophy. He's also the editor of 2 academic volumes, one entitled Science Unlimited on the Challenges of Scientism and The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. Now, his research interests include atheism and naturalism, evolutionary epistemology, beneficial misbeliefs, reasoning fallacies, and the conflict between science and religion. Now, one of his latest publications that I want to highlight today is called The Philosophy of Pseudoscience. Now, what's significant about this book is that it takes on the question that is commonly known as the demarcation problem, which is in science the question of where does science begin and where does pseudoscience begin and where does science end? What is the demarcation between the two? Now, pseudoscience, as you already know, often mimics science, using the superficial language and trappings of actual scientific research to seem more respectable. And even a well-informed public can be taken in by such questionable theories dressed up as science. And so what Maarten's book does is it presents multiple essays that explores for philosophers and sociologists, historians, and lay people on exactly how to decide what is true science and what isn't. And with that said, I want to turn it over to my friend and introduce him and say thank you so much for presenting today. I'm very excited for your lecture. You have the floor, my friend.
Thank you very much, Darren, for that very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. Well, at least I assume that some of you are attending because I can't actually see any of you, nor do I have any other proof of your existence. But sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, I guess. Is my presentation already starting? No, I think now it did. Yeah, so I'm hoping that you're seeing the same thing as I do now. This is the title slide of my presentation, In Mysterious Ways, on the cultural evolution of beliefs about the supernatural. I want to talk to you today about supernatural causation, about how God intervenes in the world. Now, some of you may be wondering, am I attending the wrong conference? Am I barking at the wrong tree here? No, I think it is an interesting question. Of course, in some sense, it is a meaningless question for atheists because we don't believe in God in the first place. So how could we think about God's mode of action or how God intervenes in the world? But I think there's a related psychological question, which is actually interesting and which bears on the existence of God and the question of atheism, as I will try to argue today. So the question itself is meaningless for atheists, but what about the believers? What about the people who unlike most of you who are listening, I guess, actually do believe in God. How do they think about divine action? What do they think about the ways that God or gods or other supernatural beings are answering prayers, or in other ways intervening in the world and doing stuff? And then what I'm really getting at eventually is this question: is the truth value of religion, whether or not God exists, is that relevant to study religion? Can you actually, like as a psychologist or as a cognitive scientist or as a sociologist, can you study religion without asking or without being willing to consider the question whether or not God exists? I think it's fairly difficult, and I want to argue that the truth value of religion, despite what some, or even many researchers have claimed, is actually relevant, and it's a question that needs to be dealt with. The reason why many researchers are reluctant to address that question is because, because of this, I think, misplaced respect that many people have for religion. And because of that respect, many academics engage in some sort of feigned neutrality. They say, oh, we're just studying religion, we're just studying religion, but we remain completely neutral about the question whether or not God exists. So this is what I will be getting at eventually. So first I'm going to talk about supernatural causation, but then I'm going to try to address the question, so how should we go about studying religion, and can we do that without addressing the truth value of religion? Most of you are probably familiar with the field, the cognitive science of religion. It's a relatively recent field. I'm not going to talk extensively about what the main tenets of the fields are, but just very basically, the starting point of the cognitive science of religion is that religious belief is not a very special, unique mode of cognition. It arises out of very ordinary psychological processes, certain evolved cognitive mechanisms that lead to religious belief, not necessarily as an adaptation, sometimes just as a byproduct. But so it arises out of very normal, ordinary cognition. So some of the most well-known scholars in that field, Pascal Boyer, Justin Barrett, Jason Sloan, etc. So those are people who study religion from a cognitive point of view. So I'm broaching the topic from that perspective. So I'm also, I've going to give a reference later on, but I published a paper in the cognitive science of religion, or about that literature, and this is what my talk is mainly based on. Now, one important concept in the cognitive science of religion, it's not the most important one, but it's the one that is most relevant for my presentation, is the idea of theological incorrectness. So what this comes down to basically is that psychologists have found that there's a discrepancy between, on the one hand, what religious people profess to believe, what the kind of answers that they would give on a survey question, and what they believe in practice, or what they implicitly believe in practice. So on the one hand, you could say you have the official theology, the thing that people have been taught in school, in religious education, and then on the other hand, you have what they intuitively believe when they're actually practicing religion. So, for example, when they're praying. And oftentimes, what we see is that this violates the official theology in a way that people don't even realize. And hence the name theological incorrectness. So people profess to believe one thing. For example, I'm going to give an example later on, or no, it's actually on this slide already. So the example is the explicit belief that God is everywhere, which is something that many people would answer if you ask him the question, well, where is God exactly? People would say, oh, but he's everywhere. He's in our hearts, and he's nowhere in particular. So that's the explicit theological belief. But then on the other hand, when people are actually praying, you can conduct psychological experiments which show that people still think of God in a pretty normal fashion as someone who is located at a particular point in space and then travels from one part of the world to another part of the world, for example, to attend to different things. People would also say, for example, that God can do many things simultaneously, but that's a very counterintuitive idea. So when people think of God answering prayers, they think of God as first attending to one prayer, then moving on to the next one, etc. So this is the basic idea of theological incorrectness. So let's talk about petitionary prayer now, because I want to apply this idea of theological correctness to this question of how God intervenes in the world according to religious beliefs. Petitionary prayer is a form of prayer in which you ask a supernatural being, God or someone else, to do something, to intervene in the world on your behalf. Now, in traditional theism, we have the three classical attributes of God, which are omniscience, benevolence, or omnibenevolence, and omnipotence. Now, if you think about it, a being that is all-powerful, that is omnipotent, could basically do anything. So, if God is also benevolent and he wants to do things, he wants to make you happy, or he wants to, to help us in some way, well, technically speaking, you would expect that you could pretty much ask anything, and God would do it. And this is indeed what is being explicitly instructed to religious believers, at least in some holy texts. So in the Bible, in the Gospel of Mark, for example, we read, "What things soever you desire when you pray, believe that you receive them and you shall have them." So sometimes people would say that they really believe that you could just ask anything, just ask anything to God, and He will always answer your prayers. But of course, in practice, that's not how it works. I mean, this is, even if people would profess to believe that, in practice, you can catch them, in the act of not really believing that. So they would be inclined to think that God acts in certain ways and not in other ways. So how does God act? So what are the intuitive beliefs that people have about some divine presence in the world? Well, there's an interesting paper by Justin Barrett, one of the most influential scholars in the field, who carried out a couple of psychological experiments. And Barrett starts out from the fact that in our ordinary everyday experience, we have three modes of causation, three things that we can engage in as human beings to affect something or someone else. So on the one hand, you have physical causation. We can pull or shove or tickle or whatever someone or something, affected in a physical way. Then we have biological causation. I can make someone ill, for example. I can poison a Russian spy. That would be a form of biological causation. Also, I mean, it's a special case of physical causation, of course. I can make someone pregnant. That's another form of sometimes very pleasant biological causation. And then you have psychosocial causation. I can affect someone else's mind. I can make someone jealous or angry, not by touching him, not by affecting him in any biological way, but just by speaking, by acting at a distance in a certain way. Now, Barrett says that even though people would profess to believe that God can act in any way he chooses, that's not what they believe in practice, but they are not given explicit instruction about what is God's preferred mode of causation. So there is a sort of theological vacuum there. I mean, it's not something that's being taught in classroom or in religious education. And Barrett's idea is that this theological vacuum is filled up by ordinary cognition. As I already pointed out, people don't think of God as really being everywhere at the same time. They think of him as a human-like agent that is far away, located in heaven or in a specific place. In any event, not here on earth. He's very, very distant. Now, if you think of someone who's very distant from you, then the only kind of intuitive experience that we have in everyday life of action at a distance is psychosocial causation. For example, I don't have to touch someone to make him angry. I can just pick up the phone, for example, and shout some nasty names. That will make him angry, reliably so, even though he's thousands of kilometers away. So according to Barrett, people prefer psychosocial modes of causation because this is the kind of causation that they're more familiar with in everyday life. And he did a couple of experiments, and it's confirmed his hypothesis. Indeed, people are more likely to pray for psychosocial things, God affecting us or affecting someone else in a psychosocial fashion, rather than God doing physical stuff, like physically interacting or intervening in the world. So people believe in gods who influence minds. That's Barrett's arguments. Some of you may already have a couple of objections, and I think rightly so, because I have some too. And here are the two most important ones. There's a conceptual problem with this hypothesis. Namely, the range of psychosocial causation, if you forget about technology like a telephone, but the kind of causation that already our hunter-gatherer ancestors were familiar with. Now, the range of that psychosocial causation, I mean, it's a bit more extended than physical causation, but it's not very long range either. So it's fairly limited as well. Apart from telepathy, of course. I mean, let's assume for the sake of the argument that telepathy is not real. So that's not much different from physical causation. So why would people prefer psychosocial causation if the idea is that God is very distant, and the idea that someone can affect you at a very long distance by psychosocial means is also, that's already supernatural. I mean, it's not an intuitive idea. And then, of course, I mean, the most glaring empirical problem, I think, is that it's just false that people prefer psychosocial modes of causation when they think of God. There are plenty of cases in which people pray for very tangible physical results. And I mean, there are anthropological data on that question. The belief in physical or biological causation is actually very widespread in virtually every culture around the world, so not just in theistic environments. You have people who pray to gods or spirits or whatever, or ghosts, to cure them from disease, so biological modes of causation, and also for certain physical events like weather, the rain dances, for example, whether it's praying or actually carrying out the ritual. People want the gods or the spirits to affect the atmosphere. They want it to rain, or they want protection from natural disasters, or all these kinds of things. There's also another interesting study by Pascal Boyer and his colleagues that shows that religious believers don't really care about the precise causal mechanism, like the precise modus operandi of God. The only thing that they really care about is him delivering the results. They just want the effects. They want it to rain. They want to have their cancer cured or whatever. So they want, they're pretty pragmatic about that. They don't really care about modes of causation. So why would they prefer psychosocial modes of causation over other modes of causation? I think what is going wrong here is that Barrett and also other researchers in the field are not tackling the most important question, the elephant in the room perhaps, which is God does not exist and prayer doesn't work. So why is that important? Let me just explain this for a second. Most of you are probably aware of the famous or infamous study by Benson et al. That looked into the alleged efficacy of intercessory prayer. Of course, it was a waste of money and a major disappointment for religious believers, because of course, nothing came out of that. But you could well imagine that some sort of prayer would work. And if it did, well, first of all, we could we could carry out experiments like that, and it would actually show some result. And culturally speaking, I mean, if ever there had been a religion that reliably worked, in the sense that certain prayers addressed to certain gods would reliably have certain effects, then you could imagine that this religion would spread like wildfire. I mean, it would make a huge difference between all the other false religions and then the one true religion, the only religion that actually delivers the results that for which it is true that prayer works. Now, as atheists, we of course believe that there's no such religion. Religious beliefs themselves might have a different opinion, of course, and in the Bible you can actually read some of those, like the famous competition between Baal and Yahweh on the other, on the one hand, and where they actually, they had to do some sort of miracle contest. I think they had to set aflame like a pile of woods or something like that, and Yahweh, of course, it beat the hell out of Baal, but that's of course fiction. But we could well imagine something like that happening, and if it did, I mean, even atheists would be paying attention. I mean, if prayer really did work, I'm not sure if I would just drop down on my knees and immediately accept the Lord my Savior, but at least I would be paying attention, because that would go against my whole worldview. But curiously, many researchers in the cognitive science of religion are unwilling or reluctant to address that question. So this is a typical quote in a book about theological incorrectness. It's a fairly good book, by the way. So I'm not. Most of the research in the cognitive science of religion is actually fairly high standards, but I think that there's just an important question that they refuse to address, and that is the truth value of religion. So let me read the quote for you. The content claims of religion are peripheral to the study of religion. Whether or not God exists makes little or no difference at all to the study of the brain mechanisms that are involved in the production of religious thoughts. I think that's just not true. I think if some religion would be true, then it would make a huge difference also to the brain mechanisms of the people who believe in it. True beliefs have a different dynamic than false beliefs. I mean, if you to explain why someone believes that there is a coronavirus ravaging the planet today, it's not difficult to explain that. You have to, explain it in function of the actual truth of this belief. If some people believe that, I don't know, that Bill Gates has invented the coronavirus because he wants to implant nano devices to prepare for the new world order or something like that. If you want to explain why someone believes something like that, then you have to come up with a completely different kind of explanation. So the truth of a belief also is an important factor in your psychological explanation of that belief. So how do beliefs spread and evolve? Well, it's true, of course, that there are all sorts of psychological factors, evolved intuitions that people have, certain brain mechanisms that make them believe one thing rather than the other. But there are also what we would call external constraints. So whether or not a belief is true actually plays an important role in the dynamic and in the cultural evolution of that belief. It's harder to believe in false things. So you need to come up with a special explanation why people believe something that is despite it being false. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. Why do people prefer to believe in certain forms of supernatural causation rather than others? I think the real difference is not so much between psychosocial modes of action or physical or biological. It's between, on the one hand, robust forms of actions that are tangible and visible and verifiable, and on the other hand, subtle and mysterious forms of action. So my hypothesis, I haven't tested it yet, but it's my hypothesis, is that people tend to believe in gods that move in mysterious ways, meaning they tend to believe in modes of supernatural causation that are indistinguishable from the natural course of events. So on the one hand, they would not pray for things that are flatly impossible, because then they would always be disappointed. On the other hand, they would also not pray for things that are guaranteed to happen anyway. Nobody's going to pray, or please let gravity work today so that I can sit on my chair and prepare my presentation. That's redundant. I mean, you don't have to pray for that. It will work regardless of what you do. So that's, neither of these are ideal beliefs in terms of cultural success. So what does it mean that people believe in gods that move in mysterious ways? Well, I see largely three different mysterious ways. So on the one hand, people can pray for gods to influence certain complex and stochastic processes in which the divine action is very hard to disentangle from the other factors. So, for example, people would pray for rain or protection from natural disasters, or they would pray for luck on a battlefield, and that is highly suited for religious belief, exactly because it's a very complex event and there are a lot of factors present, and it's very hard to be sure whether or not there was some sort of supernatural intervention. A second mysterious way is that God can work invisibly. So, for example, he can cure my tumor, which is somewhere in under my skull. He can make someone pregnant, which is also an invisible event that is very hard to observe directly. And then thirdly, God can work in conjunction with natural causes. So, for example, he can give me the strength to win a battle, because although of course I still have to do the fighting. So God can help me in conjunction with my own effort to do something. Or God can support a physical structure. The picture that I inserted here is from the famous Golden Rock in Myanmar, which according to legend is supported by a single hair of the Buddha. Of course, it's not only supported by a single hair of the Buddha, because you can see that it's actually also resting. It would be much more miraculous if it was just floating in midair, but that's not the kind of stuff that people believe in. So they believe that there's a